Heads or Tails is officially the pilot episode for SatAM, but for some reason was actually the last episode of Season 1 to be originally aired. I really can't think why this is, because it does set up a lot of character and story arcs that we would see during the first season. Not to mention, there is far less of a slick look to the animation in this episode. I get the feeling that the writers decided after making this episode that it felt too much like The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, so gave the design a much darker tone to give the show more individuality. Thankfully though, the awesome intro remains the same. It gives us a little backstory into Robotnik taking over, and a quick look at a basic freedom fighter mission. Fuck that, all we really care about is the awesome theme song. We open in Robotropolis, with Robotnik arriving back from a trip. They spot Tails on one of the monitors and decide to capture him by sending a buzz bomber after him. Wow, so they are actually going to use actual enemies from the games in this show? Unfortunately no, the buzz bombers in this episode are pretty much the only time we see enemies from the games. Another sign that this episode is a pilot. Meanwhile, Sonic is showing Rota how he plans to impress Sally by playing a song on his guitar, but Rota tells him Sally won't like it and that she prefers softer music, which results in one of the funniest bits of animation I've ever seen, as Sonic waves his arms around in disgust. See, that's how it works with Sonic, he wants to have it both ways. He wants to impress Sally, but at the same time, he's not interested in her kind of music. In fact, Rota seems to understand Sally far better than Sonic does. This was actually a really nice way to set up Sally as well as her relationship with Sonic before we actually meet her. You know, assuming that this is the first episode you see like it was meant to be. Suddenly Tails shows up chased by the Buzz Bomber and... Wait, what the heck has happened to Sonic's guitar? Did it melt in the sun or something? Whatever. Sonic grabs Tails and they escape just as the Buzz Bomber fires a laser which rebounds off a rock, cartoon logic I guess, right back at it. They taunt Robotnik by way of a camera, which Tails says hi mum to. Does that mean Robotnik has captured his mother and he thinks she might be watching? Or was it just a random joke? I don't know, they never mention what happened to Tails' parents on the show, so it's probably the latter. Meanwhile, the rest of the freedom fighters are attempting to build catapults. And I'm sorry, the design for Sally just cracks me up, it just looks so silly. But thankfully that personality that made her the fan favourite is the same. Sally finds that the catapults they are building keep breaking because the cotter pins are made of wood and not strong enough to take the weight. And here we get our first look at the great love-hate relationship between Sonic and Sally, as Sally becomes frustrated by Sonic's cocky attitude to what she feels is a serious problem. It's actually very similar to Han Solo and Leia's relationship in Star Wars, one of a number of Star Wars parallels this show has. Sonic heads out into Robotropolis to get the metal cotter pins. So, even though Robotropolis is a wasteland now, it still apparently has a hardware store somewhere? I don't know. But first he has to get a power ring. This is something from the games that they actually do use quite a lot during the running of the show. These rings were invented by Sonic's Uncle Chuck to give him extra speed. I don't really think Sonic needs extra speed, but whatever. For some reason, the machine that makes these rings is at the bottom of a lake, and they only appear every few hours or so. Maybe his Uncle Chuck did that deliberately to test Sonic's patience. As we will see, just like in the games, Sonic can't stand waiting around for more than a few seconds. Tails, for some unexplained reason, has decided to head out into the city alone. Sonic stops him, but decides to take Tails with him anyway, after Tails points out the chance of a buzz bomber getting him on his way back to Knothole. Now, I don't know, this seems a bit sketchy. Tails made it all the way out here without a buzz bomber getting him. Is it really more risky for him to just walk back through the forest than it is for Sonic to take him through Robotropolis, where any number of SWAT bots could get him? I think Tails is secretly just manipulating Sonic here to take him through Robotropolis. And Sonic isn't one for thinking about stuff for any decent length of time, so I guess he was fooled. Sonic finds the cotter pins they need pretty quickly, just laying on the ground. That was lucky. But then he gets distracted by some SWAT bots and mentions that his Uncle Chuck is now a SWAT bot, having been roboticized. He also notices his dog, Muskie, who has met the same fate. Sonic tries to get him to remember him, but it seems like the robot in him has taken over. Although there are a few signs that the real Muskie is still in there somewhere. This is something they would come back to later in the season, assuming, like I said before, this was the first episode you watched. We also see Sonic speed around in all sorts of different directions, which causes Tails to become nauseous, which actually makes this cartoon more realistic than the games. They come across Robotnik's control room, where he reveals he is planning to kill all the trees in the Great Forest in order to find Knothole. An evil man killing a whole forest of trees for his own selfish means? It's almost like there's some sort of subtle environmental message here. Sonic and Tails head back to the Great Forest after a quick chase with SWAT bots. Back in Knothole, Sally is bitching about Sonic risking his life to get the cotter pins she asked for, and being a bit childish. I don't really understand what she's annoyed about myself, but I guess the idea is maybe Sally doesn't either. This is just something about the way Sonic acts that she doesn't like. Bunny tells Sally... I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I was a bit distracted there. Sonic explains Robotnik's plan, but Sally has her own plan. Sonic uses his new ability to hover in mid-air to lure the buzz bombers into the range of the catapults that they've built. They defeat them by firing water balloons at them. Now, I always thought this was a bit odd. I mean, I guess it makes sense that it might short-circuit the bombers, but they are actually still active even after they've been hit, and in the end, they just retreat. Do the Freedom Fighters not have anything more effective than that they could fire at them? Overall, Heads or Tails does work well as a pilot. It sets up a few story arcs and character traits that we would see later on in the season, as well as doing a good job of defining Sonic's character and his relationship with the other main characters. It does, however, stick out like a sore thumb when compared to the rest of the season because of the more cartoonish tone of the jokes and the basic animation style, as well as the way that the enemies act. It's also interesting how Tails plays a much larger role in this episode than he does in any other episode. Maybe they were originally planning to make him Sonic's sidekick, just like he was in the Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. I wouldn't have minded that, but I'm glad they had Sally play that role instead, because while Tails is more like a lackey to Sonic, Sally is much more Sonic's equal and won't take any crap off of him. Robotnik still comes across as the same intimidating dictator with that great voice by Jim Cummings. But for a pilot, we don't really get much of a backstory into what he's done and what he's trying to do now, other than defeat the Freedom Fighters. It's also hard to be intimidated by the SWAT bots when you see them laughing at stuff, another thing they fixed in later episodes. It's interesting though that this isn't a dictator that wants to take over the world, but one that already has. You don't see that very often. For a pilot, Heads or Tails sets things up fairly well, and to be fair, the only really annoying thing, the more cartoonish style, was fixed in later episodes. As an episode on its own, it probably does lose points because of that though. Heads or Tails gets a 7 out of 10.